The birth of the architect. We can trace the origin of the term architect, the way in which we use it today, back to Leon Battista Alberti, the famous Renaissance universal man, uomo universale, who was proficient in many areas. He was an artist, he was a sculptor, he was an architect. He wrote about mathematics, he wrote about the family, about sociological questions. He wrote about perspective, and so on and so on. He was the classic universal man of the Renaissance. Of course, we know him as the architect, as an architect, as the architect of the Tempio Malatestiano in Rimini, as the architect of the facade of Santa Maria Novella in Florence, and as the architect of the facade of the Palazzo Rucellai, also in Florence, as the architect of the entire building of the Church of Sant'Andrea in Mantua. All of these buildings in Italy, and all produced around the middle of the 15th century. He was the classic Renaissance architect. And like many other individuals at the time, he was part of a whole culture in which the potential of the individual was celebrated. The individual became someone who was celebrated by society, and this is against a backdrop of the Middle Ages where people were against a backdrop of Franciscan sobriety where people were not supposed to be celebrated. So all of a sudden, with the Renaissance, we find figures like Filippo Brunelleschi, who was responsible for finding a way of fabricating the dome, of constructing the dome of Florence Cathedral, who was responsible for inventing perspective and so on. These individuals came to be celebrated in their own right. It became a culture in many ways of the individual. Likewise, Michelangelo, who was also a sculptor, an architect, an artist, and so on, another universal man, was part of this system, was an outcome of this particular system, as indeed was Leonardo, who also embraced the possibility of scientific inquiry. These were the great men, and in some cases women, of the Renaissance who signaled a shift towards a culture of the individual at a certain moment in history. The Renaissance was not simply a question of a style of architecture. No, it was about a shift in cultural horizons, about the celebration of the individual. And in the case of architecture, it was precisely when the notion of the architect that we still uphold was formulated. It was in this book, which some years ago I translated under Joseph Rickwer from Latin into English when I had just graduated from Cambridge, that Alberti defines that person, the architect. This was the first book published on architecture. In 1484 or 5, it was published, and of course, it wasn't the first book written. Vitruvius's De Architectura was written before that, but it was not published. It was not printed until afterwards. So in this book, De Re Aedificatoria, which literally means on the matter or business of building, or of architecture, which we have translated as on the art of building in 10 books. There is no 10 books in the Latin. That was Joseph's choice. In this book, in the first page of this first book to be published on architecture, the first definition of the architect that we know today is published. And here it is. Leon Battista Alberti, De Re Aedificatoria Incipit, the beginning of Leon Battista Alberti's book on the matter of building. Lege feliciter, happy reading. And here, at the very first page, he starts to lay out what he means, how he defines the architect. This is all in Latin, of course, and many of these words have been abbreviated, as was the wont of the time, as the custom of the time. Sed antiquam ultra progredia. Before I go any further, Cencio, I think explicandum mihi, I should explain whom I would have you call the architect. And it's in the male because architects in those days were all male. Uh, it was a male architect. Non enim tegnarium aducam fabrum. It's not the carpenter that I would have you compare to the greatest exponents of all the other arts. Fabri enim manus, the hand of the carpenter, of the workman. For the architect, it is but an instrument. It's a tool in the hand of the architect. The hand of the workman is but a tool in the hand of the architect. Then he goes on to define the architect as someone who, by a certain admirable reason and method, is both able to define in the mind and realize through construction whatever might meet the noble needs of mankind or humankind through the movement of weights and the joining of bodies and so on and so on and so on. Now, the point about this is a radical departure from the previous notion of what the architect was. Up until that point, the term architect had been thought to come from the Latin, arcus and tectum. An arcus meaning the arch, a tectum meaning the covering. In other words, the person who constructed the vaults, the trusses, the roof, the timber. That was what they thought of the architect. Or at least they understood the architect as being that. And of course, in those days, steeped in religious ideology and so on, there was a reason behind that. After all, Joseph, the wife of Mary, the mother of Jesus, was himself a carpenter. And the carpenter was also thought to be, because the carpenter made the roof, was closest to heaven, and so on and so on and so on. There's a whole kind of iconography, ideology associated with the carpenter. But with Alberti, the term architect gets redefined. They recognized that actually the word architect came not from the Latin, but from the Greek. It didn't have anything to do with a carpenter. Rather, it came from the Greek, and it had to do with the two terms in the word architect, archi, and tectum. In other words, archi as in archangel or arch rival, meaning the chief person, and tect referring to tectonics, the chief builder. So the architect was redefined from being a carpenter to being the chief builder, the person in charge. And it certainly wasn't the carpenter who was in charge. The carpenter, the hand of the workman, was but a tool in the hand of the architect. Now that definition has largely survived to this day. The architect is celebrated as the individual who is in charge of the building, the design and the construction process of a building. That is the notion of the architect that we have inherited essentially from 1450, from Leon Baptiste Alberti's definition of the architect in his treatise on architecture, De Re Aedificatoria, on the art of building, in 10 books, as we translated it with MIT Press.